Today our story is about Andrei Chikatilo, perhaps the most famous serial killer of the Soviet Union. In the Rostov region and other regions of the country, he committed 43 proven murders, although, according to operational data, Chikatilo had much more victims. The maniac hunted children and teenagers, lured them into his lair and brutally killed them. Andrei Chikatilo committed his first crimes while working at a school. It was then that he began to experience a perverse attraction to his students. In modern Russia, about people go missing every year, including children. They are not found. Listen to a documentary story about a Novocherkassk pervert to know the psychological portrait of a criminal. Perhaps someday it will help save someone's life. Andrei Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936 in the village of Yablochnoye, Kharkov, now Sumy, region. His father Roman was a descendant of a dispossessed peasant. The origin of the surname Chikatilo itself is unknown. In his mature years, Andrei tried to find out, but to no avail. When the Great Patriotic War began, he was only 4 years old. His father left to fight, he soon began to command a partisan detachment. And taking care of the boy and his older brother Stepan completely fell on the shoulders of the mother, who worked at a local state farm. For the Chikatilo family, as well as for the whole country, the hardest time has come. It is possible that the terrible pictures of the war years affected Andrei's psyche. The consequences of the bombing and the bodies of the dead, who were transported to burial sites on carts. And at the end of 1942, the Germans came to the village of Yablochnoye. Having gathered some of the local residents, the Nazis led them to be shot. Furious boys followed, among whom was 6-year-old Andrei. The children had no idea that after the execution of the adults, the Germans would open fire on them. In front of Chikatilo's eyes, peers of the same age fell, decimated by bullets. At some point, Andrei stumbled and, hitting his head on a stone, lost consciousness. He woke up among the bloody bodies. Deceased believed that he was dead and thrown into the pit along with the others. From fear, Andrei could not move and lay among the dead until morning. In 1943, a younger sister, Tatiana, was born to Chikatilo. This story in the family was shrouded in mystery. After all, the girl was born at that moment, when the head of the family has been at the front for a couple of years. According to some reports, Andrei's mother could become pregnant after being raped by a German soldier. Be that as it may, after the birth of Tatiana, the Chikatilo family was on the brink of survival. Lump from hunger walked in order to survive. What kind of caresses are there? Andrei recalled many years later. In order to somehow drown out hunger, he even had to eat grass and roots. At the time, he developed the main fear of his entire life, the fear of being eaten. It was this fate, according to Andrei's mother, befell his older brother Stepan, which was kidnapped and eaten by the neighbors distraught with hunger. There is a version that the boy was actually eaten by his own relatives, but she has no reliable confirmation. The fight against the Nazis for Father Andrei ended with German captivity, where he worked in a mine and spent some time in a concentration camp. Roman was liberated by the Allied troops, but the camps of Sumy and Novocherkassk were waiting for him at home. Their Chikatilo Sr., a patient with tuberculosis, was sent because of suspicion of complicity with the Nazis. Having survived in a concentration camp, he did not survive the Soviet camps. As for Andrei, the war years did not spare his psyche, and he already had problems with his health. Even at birth, doctors found signs of dropsy of the brain in the boy. Later, the neurological symptoms only worsened due to several concussions. In addition, until the age of 12, Andrei suffered from enuresis, but there was no talk of treatment at the difficult time. Andrei went to school when he was less than 8 years old, in 1944. At the same time, he was a very absent-minded and timid student, forgetting his notebook and ink at home. Chikatilo was embarrassed to ask his classmates and the teacher for help, but just sat and cried. Sometimes a schoolboy would faint under the desk in a hungry swoon. Andrei was plunged into despair, and the fact that he could not see what was written on the blackboard suffered from myopia. By the way, Chikatilo began to wear glasses only after 30 years, when he ceased to be afraid of the offensive nickname bespectacled for him. Andrei's hysterical behavior turned into constant ridicule and bullying from his peers. They beat the teenager, teased the woman and the bastards, but he did not dare to hit them back. All my life they wiped their feet on me, they did not consider me a human being everywhere. Chikatilo will complain many years later. Meanwhile, during his school years, Andrei was really fascinated by politics. Chikatilo said that by the time of Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, he was a 16-year-old teenager. Possessed such deep knowledge in the field of Marxism and Leninism that he could have easily ruled the Soviet Union. After graduating from school almost an excellent student, Andrei had only one grade 4 in German. The 17-year-old boy decided to become a lawyer, and in 1954 he applied to Moscow State University. However, he could not do so, he did not pass the competition. However, for himself Chikatilo found another explanation: he, as the son of a repressed, just closed the way to a prestigious university. The only thing that Andrei managed that year was to enter the communications school, located in the urban-type settlement of Aktursky in the Kuban. But Andrei did not leave his dreams of higher education, and, after graduating from technical school, conceived of becoming a railway engineer, enrolling in the correspondence department at the Capital Institute. But 2 years later, Chikatilo dropped out and at 23 went to the army. At first he got into the KGB border troops, prestigious at the time in Central Asia. And then, thanks to his education, he went to serve as a signalman in Berlin. According to some reports, during the service, Chikatilo could become a victim of sexual violence by colleagues, which left another imprint on his psyche. After demobilization, Chikatilo decided to start life from scratch. Moved to the Rostov region and got a job at a telephone exchange in the Rodionovo-Nesvitayskaya settlement. Along the way, Andrei began to write notes for local publications on various topics as a freelance correspondent. Life was getting better. In 1963, Chikatilo married and entered Rostov State University, to the correspondence department of the Faculty of Philology, and then to the University of Marxism and Leninism at one of the pedagogical universities of the Kuban. Having received the coveted diplomas, Chikatilo decided to become a teacher. In 1970, he got a job as a teacher of Russian language and literature at a boarding school in the city of Novocherkassk. It would seem that everything was going well, but the 34-year-old teacher began to show strange things. He began to harass the students. Pretending to be a caring teacher, Chikatilo sat down with schoolgirls, ostensibly to explain difficult moments in his studies, and he himself began to touch the girls. And sometimes Andrei waited until the students began to get ready for bed and undress, after which he suddenly entered their bedroom. Soon, conversations about the teacher's inappropriate behavior reached the boarding school management, and Chikatilo himself gave a reason for dismissal. On one of the warm days, he took his charges to swim in a local reservoir. At some point, Andrei noticed that one of the high school students swam far away. Having portrayed concern for the girl's life, the teacher swam up to her and began to pester her. The schoolgirl began to fight back, and Chikatilo suddenly realized that he was excited by the screams and resistance of the teenager. But this trick cost him his job. Chikatilo was forced to write a letter of resignation of his own free will. In general, some oddities in sexual behavior and difficulties in an intimate matter appeared in Chikatilo back in school years. According to his own recollections, he received his first sexual satisfaction as a 10th grader. Once a 13-year-old friend came to visit his younger sister, but not Tatiana. Neither their mother was at home at the time. And Chikatilo, feeling the excitement at the sight of blue pantaloons that peeped out from under the guest's dress, attacked the girl. He knocked her down on the floor and lay on top himself, and already from this he felt satisfaction. And even if the schoolgirl did not understand anything, Chikatilo himself was ashamed of his act. After this incident, he decided that he would only have sex with his own wife. Chikatilo decided to marry at the age of 25, but his chosen one answered him with a sharp refusal and said that he will not associate his life with an impotent person. Moreover, before refusing Andrei, the girl discussed his intimate problems with her friends. As a result, the whole village where Chikatilo lived learned about it, and he himself once again turned into an object of ridicule. His later attempts to have sex with women invariably ended in failure, and Andrew, admitting himself impotent, several times he tried to commit suicide. As a result, Chikatilo married at the age of 27 Feodosia Odinicheva, a friend of his sister Tatiana, who introduced them. Chikatilo and Theodosia, whom he affectionately called Fiolatka, lived peacefully. However, the couple had problems with their intimate life. But, despite impotence, Andrei nevertheless became a father. A daughter and a son appeared in his family with a difference of 3 years. At the same time, secretly from his wife, Chikatilo regularly went to prostitutes. In 1978, having managed to work for a short time as a master of the teaching process at the city vocational school, Gietu, 42-year-old Chikatilo moved with his family to the city of Shakti, now the Rostov region. There he got a job as a teacher at a local school. Deviations in his behavior became more and more noticeable. Not embarrassed by those around him, he thrust his hands into the pockets of his pants and touched his genitals in front of the students. Those, in turn, showered the teacher with ridicule and teased him directly in the face with a pervert and a masturbator. It all ended with the fact that one day Chikatilo put his hand in the panties of his 15-year-old pupil. The teenager made a fuss, to which his peers came running. They attacked the pedophile in a crowd and beat him. After this incident, the teaching career came to an end. The first murder Andrei Chikatilo committed in the same 1978. Having moved to Shakti, Chikatilo bought a dilapidated hothouse with the secretly accumulated 1,500 rubles, where he took girls of easy virtue. On December 22, he lured an 8-year-old girl into this dwelling. He promised to treat her with imported chewing gum. But as soon as the gullible child entered the room, the maniac threw the victim on the bed and began to tear off her clothes. The girl screamed loudly and began to fight back, which provoked Chikatilo even more. Having experienced sexual satisfaction, the maniac stabbed the schoolgirl several times in the stomach with a knife and then strangled her. Having outraged the body, he carried it out of the house and threw it into the local river Grushevka. As soon as the deceased was found, investigators began interviewing local residents. Some of them remembered they saw the murdered in the company of a strange man. An identikit was drawn up, and a little later the director of the Gietu, where Chikatilo worked, confidently identified him as his employee. Andrei's wife, in a conversation with the detectives, kept silent about the oddities that began to happen to her husband lately. In an inadequate state, he ran away somewhere, then returned, looked for something and ran away again. Moreover, Theodosia lied to the investigators that on the day of the murder Chikatilo was at home. So the maniac had an alibi. Meanwhile, the law enforcement officers were in a hurry to report to the leadership before the new year about the successful solution of the crime. While some detectives were talking with Chikatilo's wife, their colleagues detained a certain Alexander Kravchenko, previously convicted and served 10 years for the murder of a little girl. At the same time, Kravchenko's wife assured that on the day of the crime, her husband was at home. Kravchenko was initially released, but soon he was again taken to the department. He robbed a neighbor. In the cell to the suspect, the operatives put a drug addict who beat Kravchenko, demanding to confess also to the murder of the girl. He could not stand the bullying and signed a confession. Around the same time, the police intimidated Kravchenko's wife. They promised to involve her as an accomplice in the event that she does not admit to perjury about that the husband was at home. As a result, the operatives got their way. They immediately forgot about Chikatilo, and Kravchenko was tried and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Later, under pressure from the relatives of the deceased girl, his case was reviewed and sentenced to death. Andrei Chikatilo himself hid after the first crime. He got scared that the next murder would result in his capture. However, a few months later, the maniac dealt with a 17-year-old vocational school student. According to some reports, the girl earned a living by prostitution, and she herself agreed to go with the stranger to the uninhabited bank of the Don. Chikatilo tried to have sex with her, but once again failed, and the student laughed. And he also says, "Your machine doesn't work." And he starts laughing. This, of course, infuriated me. After all, I was disgraced. I started to discharge my psyche. I cut everything without looking, the maniac recalled. A terrible death awaited his second victim. Chikatilo bit off the victim's nipples and stuffed her mouth with mud so that she suffocated. During the investigation, the maniac himself confessed to this crime and the first massacre of an 8-year-old girl. Nevertheless, the prosecution failed to prove these episodes. But Chikatilo's involvement in the next murder of a 13-year-old schoolgirl, which the maniac dealt with in June 1982, has been fully proven. Following her in the same 1982, the maniac dealt with another 6 children aged from 9 to 16 years. He looked for his victims at railway stations, bus stops, on trains and buses. He looked out for children who were without parents. Chikatilo got to know them, rubbed into their confidence and, under various pretexts, took away with him. Promised entertainment, chewing gum or something else. Sometimes the children followed their killer for several kilometers. Chikatilo mocked them, dismembered them while the victims were still alive, cut off the genitals, cut out the insides. The detectives who followed the trail of the maniac at first thought that they were dealing with a morgue employee. A lot of people who know about the rules for opening bodies. The gender of the victims did not play any role for Chikatilo. It was much more important that because of their young age they could not resist the maniac killing. He felt his strength and power over the victims, but still, choosing another target for reprisal. Chikatilo preferred teenagers with light brown and straight hair. Dealing with the victims, Chikatilo gave free rein to his sick fantasies. Sometimes he used a knife blade as a dildo. He thrust it into the victim's body and made movements characteristic of intercourse. But the most important thing for the killer was to gouge out his victim's eyes. According to some reports, Chikatilo read somewhere that his portrait could be imprinted on the retinas of the dead, which he was very afraid of. According to others, the maniac felt shame and guilt before the victims and did not want to, so that they look at him at the moments of committing crimes. Chikatilo sometimes took parts of the bodies of the dead with him. His wife recalled that the maniac always took a small saucepan with him on business trips. And the killer himself admitted that he cut out the genitals of the victims in order to eat. I read somewhere that this method improves potency. As for the clothes and shoes of the victims, Chikatilo cut them into pieces and scattered them around the neighborhood. Traces of blood and dirt were constantly left on the maniac's clothes. Sometimes Chikatilo flushed them in public toilets at train stations. Later, the maniac admitted that police sometimes caught him in this case, but he did not arouse any interest in them. Studying the remains of Chikatilo's victims, the detectives sometimes refused to believe that these crimes are the work of a sane person. The investigation was inclined to believe that children and adolescents are being killed by a mysterious psychopath. In 1983, they had the opportunity to confirm their guesses during the investigation of the episode, which went down in the history of Russian forensic science as the case of fools. In general, because of people like Chikatilo, it is necessary to change the criminal code. What do you, viewers of our channel, think about this? Write in the comments. And also do not forget to share this video on your social networks. Press the subscribe button and the bell for new movie notifications. Please move on to other videos that you currently see in the end screensavers.